We're good.
Oh, good.
Yep. All right. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us this fine Saturday morning with the Egypt Exploration Society of Southern California, where we're hosting Dr. Bob Bianchi, where he'll present his lecture on the death of the famous Cleopatra. So thank you, Doctor, for joining us, and we'll get started. So I'll leave the floor open to you. I'm not really that good with introductions, so forgive me for the short introduction, but I'll let you start.
Hey, well, thank you, Benjamin. And I want to say hello to everyone, wherever you may be enjoying this lecture, brought to you through the technological benefits of Zoom. I personally have enjoyed a long-standing relationship with the Egypt Exploration Organization of South California, and I found that relationship very professionally and personally very, very rewarding. And so I am very, very happy and honored and thrilled that I've been asked to present this lecture to that organization today. Cleopatra is suggested to have been 39 years old when she committed suicide on that fateful August 12th, 30 BC, during her 22nd regnal year. This image in the Vatican is universally accepted as the best ancient representation of the queen. The bump or boss that you see here on her left cheek is suggested to be the point of contact of the finger of her son Caesarion, because scholars would like to reconstruct this statue somewhat on the order of this statuette in Mannheim, Germany, which represents Aphrodite holding Eros on her shoulder. Oh, whoa, whoa, whoa. Despite the media hype, very few academics now endorse the suggestion of Kathleen Martinez, a Dominican attorney turned archaeologist, who suggests that the tomb of Cleopatra is located here, somewhere beneath the structure known as the replica of the Pharos of Alexandria at Capitolaris Magna, along the coast to the west of Alexandria. And this is certainly not Cleopatra's mummified left hand, despite the documentation that you see here on the left-hand side. And there's also remind you that there was a media report in 1952 that circulated that indicated that the mummy of Cleopatra was actually found. But that proved to be equally bogus when an autopsy revealed that the body actually belonged to an Algerian soldier. Her death is commemorated in ways that we may not initially recognize. Her death prompted Romans to name the 8th month of the Egyptian calendar after the Roman Emperor Augustus, during whose reign Cleopatra's murder took place. And today, we still call the 8th month of our calendar Augustus, perhaps not understanding that the name was given to that month because it is the month in which Cleopatra died. My lecture today is divided into two parts: the death of Cleopatra where and the death of Cleopatra how. I base both halves of this lecture on an analysis of every single Greek and Latin source that mentions her death. To the best of my information, this is the very first analysis of this literary testimony, which studies in depth the context, the vocabulary, and the grammar. And I want to say that I read all of these, but not in a binge setting. Okay. I've been doing this since 1980. So over the course of 40 years, I've had a chance to read all of the Greek and Latin texts, synthesize them, reread them, compare them, and go back. The first part of today's lecture, where, is a work in progress. I still have a few more tweaks to work out. And we want to begin by looking at ancient Alexandria today. This is the city from the air, according to Google Maps. And you can see that it has the promontory here of the Heptastadium and the peninsula of Sicily here. And they look like two arms that are hugging the bay. But Alexandria, during the time of Cleopatra the Great, had a completely different aspect. The bay, which today on Google Maps is empty, was in antiquity during the time of Cleopatra filled with islands and promontories that you can see here reconstructed in green and yellow. Their disappearance is due to geologic activity, subsidence, and seismic activity as well. So we want to turn to a description by Strabo, geography. He says, and please understand, the arrow represents Strabo entering the harbor. So his definition left and right are changed because we have to turn ourselves around. His back is north, and that's why his left is our right. In the Great Harbor at the entrance on the right hand are the island and Pharos Lighthouse over here. And on the left, there are a reef of rocks, and with the promontory Lochias, that's located right here, with a palace on it. And at the entrance on the left are the inner palaces, which are contiguous with those on Lochias, and they contain numerous painted apartments and groves. Below lies the artificial enclosed harbor, appropriated to the use of the kings, and Antirotus, a small island facing the artificial harbor with a palace on it and a small port. It was called Antirotus, a rival, as it were, of the island of Rhodes. So what Strabo is describing is an area that I've outlined with this elliptical blue circle here to show that Lochias Peninsula, Sicily here, is basically where Strabo situates the palace area. Now, as we look at this, we find out that very few ancient sources, and here's the 29 of them listed for your reference. Destruction which you're committed suicide is described in very, very little detail because most of the ancient authors simply dismiss the venue with a single noun. Strabo calls it a prison, Martial calls it a royal sepulchre, Statius calls it a snake-haunted halls, Florus calls it a mausoleum. But these nouns are not expanded upon. So Strabo, for example, doesn't describe the prison, and Florus does not describe the mausoleum. So we have to plumb these sources to try to squeeze out every drop of information we can about what this building actually looked like. And we begin by looking at Plutarch's Life of Antony. And Plutarch tells us she herself, now that she had a tomb and a monument built, surpassingly lovely and beautiful, which she had erected near the Temple of Isis. So from Plutarch, we learn that the building was a tomb and it was near the Temple of Isis. Plutarch continues to tell us that some people they saw some traces of it near the sea. The traces.
I know. Anyway, I've got.
What's happening?
Sorry, somebody was joining us and they didn't mute.
Okay. The traces that Plutarch mentions here are of the snake that some people thought bit her. But the important point here is that this building is near the sea and it had windows. So we know it had a sea view and it had windows so you could see the sea and enjoy that view. Dio Cassis adds very, very important information. He tells us that Cleopatra had collected it all in her tomb, all of her treasures, which she was constructing on the royal grounds, and she threatened to burn it all up with her in case she should fail of even the slightest of her demands. So Dio adds, the tomb was under construction. It was never completed. And he also tells us it was in the royal quarter. And then Dio adds an interesting detail. When Antony was committing suicide and missed, and they tried to bring his dying body up into Cleopatra's presence, Dio tells us they tried to hoist Antony up by ropes that were hanging there to lift the stones. So we know that it was a construction site. We know that block and tackle were still in place. And we know that the structure was at least 2 stories tall because they had to raise Antony's dying body in order to be able to convey it into Cleopatra's presence. And Dio adds another interesting detail. At this outcry, as it was raised, Cleopatra, hearing it, peered out over the top of the tomb. So this passage by Dio suggests that the tomb did not yet have a roof on it. And then Dio continues to tell us, by a certain contrivance, now he doesn't really know how, the doors of this tomb, once closed, could not be opened again. So Dion tells us that despite the fact that the tomb was being built, the doorway into this building was locked from the inside. And then we have to ask ourselves, what mechanism was there used, therefore, to lock this tomb from the inside? And looking at another source, we're told that Cleopatra fled into her monument and letting down the fall, according to Plutarch. Now, the falling doors reminds one of the portcullis system that we know that the pharaonic Egyptians used to seal their tombs. So we need to ask, is this mechanism a Greek adaptation of a portcullis system that we know were being used in pharaonic tombs? And they add that even though the tomb was being built, and even though the door was locked, a Roman standing outside the door on level ground, which was strongly barred, could still hear one another's voice. So the fact that it was barred, the fact that it was being built, did not prevent a dialogue from taking place. So we see from all of these sources that the structure was in the royal quarter. It was near a temple of Isis. It had a sea view. It was under construction. It was multi-storied. It had windows. The roof was not yet finished, and the entrance was permanently locked. So by reading the passages very, very carefully, we get a list of characteristics that the structure in which Cleopatra died can be identified, or at least suggested. Now, we try to connect the dots, and this is now speculative, but it is it is based on those texts. We know that the tomb was in the royal quarter, and Strabo tells us that this is where the royal quarter is. This promontory that you see here is modernly called Cape Silsila. In antiquity, it was called Acra Lochius. Because of subsidence, the width of this promontory has shrunk. The gray area indicates its present width. The lighter blue area indicates its dimensions and antiquity. And we know from Strabo's description that there was palaces up at this end. And we know from the description that it was near a temple of Isis. And here, underwater, is the remains of a tower of a pylon. Now, this is the map made by the team led by Dr. Harry Salas. And Harry is the director of the Hellenic Institute of Ancient and Medieval Alexandrian Studies. This is the tower of the pylon underwater as his divers encountered it. And here is where he plotted it. You can visit this pylon today. It's erected at Comaldicca, one of the archaeological sites in Alexandria. And here you see two individuals that are standing by it. Now, there may be some naysayers and conspiracy theorists amongst us that are going to say, Dr. Bob, it's Cleopatra. It's an Isis temple. Why is it so relatively teeny? Our expectation might be to have something as big as the Temple of Dendera here in Alexandria. But our colleagues, architectural historians, have taken Harry's pylon and they have reconstructed what the chapel would have looked like, and they've added a figure there to give a scale, recalling the figures that are standing next to it here at Comaldicca. And what we've been able to determine is the dimensions of this chapel are very, very close to the dimensions of similar pylon-fronted chapels that are contemporary in date with the reign of Cleopatra that are erected in front of the pyramids in Sudan in Meroe. So we have an Egyptian-style temple found in the water where we think the tomb of Cleopatra is going to be located. And I hasten to add that the pylon tower that Harry's team found is the only architectural element in a pharaonic idiom that has ever been found to date in the city of Alexandria. Every other architectural element is Greek or Roman in its design. So looking at Harry's pylon and thinking that we are in the vicinity of the tomb, we now see the Dio's crime. They had to hoist him up by ropes that were used to lift the stone blocks. And here we have an artist's rendition of what that tomb may have been, painted by Himmelmacher, the dying Anthony brought to Cleopatra. Now, if we put all of this together, we have a hypothetical reconstruction of the tomb by our German colleagues. And they suggest it is a two-story building, the second floor of which has windows. They disregard the fact that it had no roof. They put a roof on it. And hypothetically thinking there may have been a special room on the second floor where she may have committed suicide. Now, the interesting thing about this recreation is that we actually have tombs like Tomb GB1424 at Tuna El Gebel in Middle Egypt. Tuna El Gebel is not very far from Tel El Amarna. Tourists go to Tuna El Gebel to see the tomb of Osiris. And this tomb, dated to the Ptolemaic period, is definitely two stories and definitely has windows in the second story. So the hypothetical reconstruction by our German colleagues is based on reality, because we do have a tomb dated to the period on which this reconstruction is based. But we can go further because we have in Palestrina Praeneste, Italy, this is a short bus ride away from Rome. Praeneste, Palestrina is very near the Villa Tivoli, Hadrian's Villa. It's very near the Villa d'Este with its waterfalls, water features, and gardens. And this mosaic is suggested to have been created by an Alexandrian artist in the 1st century BC, roughly contemporary with Cleopatra. And it represents an artist's imagination of what a map of Alexandria, Egypt's topography was, beginning in the north in the Sudan and coming down into the Nile Delta with the 7 branches of the Nile River. And if you look, the mosaic is peppered with towers, multi-story buildings. They're all over the place, all of which are feature windows in the upper stories. And architectural historians suggest that if one visits the tombs of Petra, the Rose City in Jordan, the tombs there are 3 stories, sometimes 4 stories tall. And architectural historians suggest that the tombs in Petra are evocations and variations of the multi-story tomb in which Cleopatra met her death. And I have to point out that when we look at these tombs from Petra, only the bottom are open with chambers. The upper stories are simply relief decoration on the facade. You cannot enter the upper stories. They're simply show. And we compare that evidence from Petra with the German hypothetical reconstruction, and we look at models, so-called sculptors' models, architectural models, that are in museums that are dated to the Ptolemaic period. And what we see are tower structures, multi-storied, with an entrance on the ground floor, reminding us that the entrance to Cleopatra's tomb was blocked. And the upper stories have windows. And that structures like this were actually built can be seen by looking at this vintage photograph of a street in the city of Karanis in the Fayum. And these are of mud brick naturally, but they're not of stone. But these are multi-story buildings with windows. And these towers-like structures are mentioned in Greek papyri. The noun is pyrgos, or tower. And here is an architectural rendering of what one of them might look like, with a person on the outside and a person on the inside. And you notice that the scale is very, very close to the scale of the reconstruction of the Temple of Isis, that the pylon that Harry found. And here we have a very, very interesting comparison to make, because we know Egyptian royal tombs from the Valley of the Kings are underground. Here, Cleopatra's tomb is a high rise, and there are some individuals that suggest that the inspiration for building a high-rise tomb may have been the height of the Pharos lighthouse that you see here. And there's a very, very significant point to emphasize as well from a structural point of view. The Pharos lighthouse is erected on a standalone island, according to the information that the French team has developed. And this lighthouse had to have been erected using block and tackle cranes and pulleys. And this is not a pharaonic Egyptian way of erecting a tall building. But the literary sources tell us that that's exactly the technique that Cleopatra was using in this unfinished tomb in which she met her demise. And so this is my hypothetical reconstruction of what the tomb looked like in which Cleopatra met her death. And this painting is an evocation of what that might have looked like. A multi-storied building in which the block and tackle was still available, the bottom door of which was locked and was still under construction. Future prospects. Scott Perney, the executive producer and creator of the Alexandria Project, Shahrukh El-Attar, the CEO of Yoda Productions in Cairo, our producer, and the award-winning Cannes Film Festival recipient Mina Nabil, our director and director of photography, have joined together to put together a project, the objective of which is to bring to the television home screen 6 to 8 one-hour episodes documenting the intellectual legacy of Alexandria. And part of those documentary episodes are going to deal with the career and impact of Cleopatra on that intellectual legacy. And so the Alexandria team has partnered with an Egyptian underwater mission, and we have the concession to a 1.5 square area to the east of Lochias, where Harry Salas found the pylon. And we plan to return in October, November of this year to do a non-invasive ground penetrating tomographic study mapping the debris field. And we have the potential to go down under the floor of the seabed to see what's there. And this data, we hope, will bring more architectural elements to our attention. And we might, jigsaw puzzle-like, put these pieces together in order to get more information about the pylon structure and perhaps even about the tomb of Cleopatra. It's all hypothetical. And if we're successful, Noel, maybe you'll invite me to come back next year to tell you what the results of that expedition are going to be like.
I'm stopping you in the middle just to share with everybody the fabulous scholarship and the years of work we have just had digested in less than a half an hour. I have never, Dr. Bob is always succinct, intelligent, and enlightening. And just for halfway through, thank you.
Thank you, Noel, for the commercial. Now we look at the second half, the death of Cleopatra. How? What you're going to hear from me now is a summation of what is going to be published in the next issue of Chronique d'Egypte. I was very, very terrified to submit this article because Chronique d'Egypte, is the Egyptological journal out of Belgium, is notorious for picking on Greek and Roman historians that study the texts. So what I did is I read each of these 29 sources in the original Greek, in the original Latin. I synthesized it, and I'm now going to present soon to be published information to everybody that's in this audience right now. And it's very, very complex. We start with Plutarch. And in Plutarch's Life of Athens says, moreover, there was a physician in her company of intimates, Olympus, to whom she told the truth, And she had this counsel and assistance in compassing her death, as Olympus himself testifies in a history of these events, which he published. Is a significant passage. Cleopatra, according to Plutarch, was assisted, she had assisted suicide by a doctor, and the doctor wrote about it. If we had that publication of the doctor, I wouldn't be here giving you that lecture, because what happened subsequently is very, very perplexing. Strabo, writing in 20 BC, visits Egypt. Strabo is an intimate of Augustus. He is given a tour of Egypt by Gallus, Augustus's hand-picked first prefect administrator of the province. Strabo spends 5 years in Alexandria, presumably in the library, doing research for his geography. And the geography, by the way, by Strabo, is the longest preserved literary work from antiquity in Greek that we have to this day. So we assume that Strabo would have found and could have read the document by Olympus. And what does Strabo tell us? He, Octavian, forced Antony to put himself to death and Cleopatra to come into his power alive. But a little later, she too put herself to death secretly by the bite of an asp or by applying a poisonous ointment. Here's a man intimate with the principles that were there when she died. And he doesn't know whether she got bitten by a snake or whether she pricked herself with a needle to inject herself with poison. And that ambiguity persists because Dio Cassius, writing a century or so later, elaborates on Strabo when he says, when Caesar, that means Augustus, heard of Cleopatra's death, he was astounded and not only viewed her body, but also made use of an antidote and psylli in the hope that she might revive. Now, Dio Cassius said, Augustus doesn't know what happened, so he tried to give her an antidote if she was poisoned, and then he hired these psylli, and these are professionals whose job it is to suck the venom out of the body of people that have been bit by venomous snakes. So the persistence in the tradition, we still don't know. Death by snake bite, death by being injected by poison. And then John Malalas, writing in Greek in the early Byzantine period, flat out states both Mark Antony and Cleopatra were victims of assassination or homicide, murder by hire. They were offed by an order of Augustus. And then we have the supposition that maybe she died by drinking poison. And here is a fresco from Pompeii, from the house of Giuseppe II, which sees a woman with a cup. She's about to drink poison. And here's that famous painting by Alexander Cabanel, Cleopatra testing the efficacy of various poisons on those condemned to death. Now we have to understand there is not a single ancient source that attributes her death to drinking poison. The ancient sources say she injected, yes, injected, but did not ingest. So we can put these two pieces of evidence aside as non-supportable. And then we have a very, very significant and often overlooked piece of evidence. The first is a text by Ponanius. The canopic queen of the Pharos was once represented by a handmade painting which depicted a lively snake gleefully about to seal her fate by biting her breast. Just look at how lifelike that painting really is. One can almost feel her pain and experience her death. And Plutarch adds, writing later, and this Caesar, meaning Augustus, also seems to have believed, for in his triumph, an image of Cleopatra herself with an apse clinging to her was carried in the procession. Now, what these two passages refer to is Augustus returned to Rome triumphantly, and he wanted to have a parade through the streets of Rome. Now, think of this as a Mardi Gras parade, the Rose Bowl parade, a Thanksgiving Day parade. Augustus could not have Cleopatra dragged through the streets in person because she was dead. So Augustus decides to have the next best thing. And the next best thing is a painting that represents the way she died. And Augustus commissioned that painting because, as Plutarch says, it was as he seemed to have believed. And here we have in the cubiculum in the Via Latina, the Via Dino Campania, in the catacombs in Rome, what was once thought to be an evocation of this now lost tableau, where we see a semi-nude woman with a snake coming up on her body. We now know that this has nothing to do with Cleopatra. This painting now represents the earth goddess Tellus, but it gives us an idea of what this lost painting might have looked like. And it's very, very important to remember that Ponanius lived during the time that this parade took place. He was living in Rome. So there's a very, very good chance that what Ponanius describes in this passage is based on what he actually saw in that procession. And unfortunately, that painting has not survived. But that painting may represent Augustus's position that she died by the bite of a single snake. But that position seems to be contradicted because Horace writes, and courageously even dared to grasp the poisonous snakes so that her body might drink in their black venom. And Virgil in the Aeneid writes, she is not aware that there are two snakes behind her. Now, what's important is Horace and Virgil are two basic poets laureate. They are writing their poetry during the reign of Augustus, and he is sponsoring their literary effort. And so it's a strange sorry, that Horace and Virgil claim more than one snake contributed to her death when the painting that Augustus commissioned has only one snake. And that tradition of two snakes is represented in this early Flemish painting by an anonymous individual. And these passages invite further questions. Plutarch two small puncture marks on her arm. Well, which arm? Her left arm or her left arm? Or right or left arm? Polonius tells us biting her breast. Which breast? The left one or the right one? And if you think these are idle questions, a very, very serious scholar studying Islamic medical texts has recently suggested that if the snake bit Cleopatra on the breast, he bit her on the left breast because the argument is Cleopatra was a student of medicine. She realized that the left breast was closest to her heart, and therefore the point of entry of the venom would have a direct route to her heart, for what it's worth. And now we have to look at containers. If it was a snake or snakes, how was it brought into her presence? A basket of figs with leaves? It is said that the ass was brought with those figs and leaves and lay hidden underneath them. But did it come in a jar? Some say she applied to herself an asp which had been brought into her in a water jar. And some say, or perhaps the snake was hidden in some flowers. Okay, a tray with figs and leaves, a jar of water. Oh, getting ahead of myself. I'm sorry. I can't get up there. The miracles of somebody being clumsy. Or hidden in a bouquet of flowers. When we ask snake charmers of Egypt about whether or not they can conceal a snake in either of these three containers, the answer is no. The snake, the cobra, in order to do that would be too big and could not be concealed within either of those three containers. So now, in order to try to resolve this issue, let's embark on a vocabulary lesson. Of the 29 Greek and Roman authors that we've studied, the overwhelming number of Latin authors use one of four nouns. They use aspis, columbra, serpens, or vipera. All of the Greek sources that mention the death use one word, aspidos. Now, if you look up each of these Latin words in a Latin dictionary, you will find out that they only mean snake generically. And if you look up the Greek aspidos, you'll find that it too means snake generically. So neither the Latin nor the Greek words used by those 29 authors specify the species of the snake. And here's something that's even more remarkable. It is common knowledge that the ancient Greeks had a word for everything. And if you go to a Greek dictionary, any Greek dictionary, you will find the Greek noun uraeus, from which our English word uraeus comes from. And that is the snake that's on top of the nemes of royal representations of pharaohs that we're all used to seeing. Philologists tell us that the Greek word uraeus is actually derived from the Egyptian noun irit, and the Egyptian noun absolutely means cobra. So now, if the Greeks have a word for cobra, and if Greek authors are writing about the death of Cleopatra, If they knew it was a cobra, why did they not use the word in the Greek language that means cobra? They don't. They use the generic word. And there's a tendency on the part of our moderns to look at the word aspis or aspidos and say, that's an asp, which we're going to define as the horned viper, the Abu Dafina, the father of death. But if you look at herpetological studies, both ancient and modern, and I'm talking about Nicander, writing in the 4th century, who wrote a book, Theriaca, and he's got passages that are devoted to snakes. If you look at the papyrus that deals with snakes in the Delta by Sonoron, which has been revisited by Sanchez, Meltzer, and company, the noun aspis aspidos in all of these herpetological treatises is neither a horned viper and certainly not a cobra. So all of the words that are used in these ancient sources do not specify the snake. They just tell us it is a snake. And now we need a grammar lesson. Latin is a declined language, and it has 2 cases, 2 numbers. Latin has a singular, 1. Latin has a plural, more than 1. Greek nouns have 3 numbers. They have a singular, they have a dual, which specifically means 2, and they have a plural, which means more than 2. The only source we have that specifies 2 snakes is Virgil in verse 697 of Book 8 of the Aeneid. And he says 2 snakes, geminus anguis. Now, Virgil in Book 8 of the Aeneid is describing Dido. And Dido is the precursor of Cleopatra, both women arch enemies of Rome. And when Virgil associates Cleopatra with 2 snakes, we know, if you look at all Greek and Latin literature, that when death is delivered by a snake, it is a Greek and Latin literary tradition that the snake that deliver the bite is always a pair. So Virgil's use of 2 snakes is more of a literary conceit than a historical fact. And we add to that absolutely no Greek author using the noun aspis puts it in the dual. It is either in the singular or the plural. So when someone quotes Horace or one of the Greek authors and says 2 snakes as an interpretation of what the dual means, they are putting a burden on the grammar that it will not support. So the literary testimony simply tells us it's 1 snake or more than 1 snake. No one source says 2 snakes. So this survey of the sources just cited and discussed offers us a full menu of alternatives as to how Cleopatra died. Namely, she was bitten by 1 snake. Virgil, she was bitten by 2 snakes. She was bitten by more snakes. She pricked herself with a drug. She was assassinated by the agents of Octavian. With this menu of options, how is a modern commentator to decide? In the final analysis, should one simply rely on statistics? Because the overwhelming majority of those ancient sources argue for the primacy of a bite of a single snake. The bite of a single snake of an unidentifiable species. Of an unidentifiable species, and certainly not a cobra. And that single snake, as the principal agent of her death, is in conformity with the description we have of the tableau that was carried in the procession organized by Augustus. All of these options, all of these questions would presumably never have been raised if Olympus's account of Cleopatra's death had either been preserved or more specifically referenced. Thank you. And I'll be prepared to answer any questions if there are any.
Before